have a tough conversation.
I can't have another one this week, Guy. I just can't.
All right. Why can't you have more than one tough conversation?
At a time, because they are emotionally exhausting.
There
is a level of bandwidth to having these kind of emotional conversations and tough conversations and honest conversations where it just takes a lot out of you. And we're still in like classroom honeymoon period, right? Like it's week 3 here at UNL and you know, we haven't had the first big assessments yet, so everyone still kind of has an A in their heads. They're learning, but there isn't necessarily anything around like achievement or behavior that has like raised flags yet. So it's kind of this honeymoon period, which is lovely, but I'm prepared.
You're prepared. I'm already supposed to have some tough conversations, so this would be great. Maybe I'll get a few points. So I taught my first class because I work with graduate students. I taught the first class this weekend. It was fantastic, but we're starting to anticipate some challenges and have to have some conversations.
There's some things that like I've got some bullet points for certain students where I'm like, I might have to talk about that later if that doesn't correct itself.
So I think that
a
big part of what we're saying, and hi, I'm Guy Trainin, a professor in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Teacher Education here at UNL.
And he's not that kind of doctor. Neither am I. I'm Nick Huseby. I am an associate professor of elementary education, K-6. My Invisalign is killing me today, so I apologize for what that makes my voice sound like.
Okay. It sounds fine to me, but okay.
Does it? It feels weird in my mouth. This is the first try where I'm like, ugh. It's going to complicate difficult conversations because I sound like I'm slurring everything. Okay. So
yeah. So tough conversations, and we're talking especially with students, although tough conversations are in no way restricted to students. We have colleagues, we have other people in our sphere that we have to have conversation about what's happening. But today we're focusing on our students.
On particularly students, yeah. And really I think one of the most important things to keep in mind about tough conversations is one does not just have a difficult conversation, right? Like so much of this is about establishing trust and rapport in those first few weeks. So we're in week 3. I'm still learning names. I've got a larger class this semester. And I am starting to like figure out what's up with certain students and connecting with them and connecting around their interests. And, you know, they're starting to see that like, I'm not just some crazy guy who's making them learn insane things in this class, that these things are actually useful, right? So that trust and rapport of, I'm going to ask you to do some things, but I'm also going to prepare you to do them.
Yes.
Is really important. I'm also going to try to get to know you as best as I can within the state that we're in.
And I think you're making the point, besides establishing trust, is that you need to establish trust, but also if you're starting to sense that there are problems, you need to wait a little bit because they're getting to know you, you're getting to know them. So as part of instruction, even if there's a problem that you've identified early on, like we've had our first meeting, but I'm identifying some problems, I'm not going to have this conversation right now. As you said, I'm going to keep my eyes. If it comes back, we're going to have a conversation. But right now, it's everybody testing their boundaries and finding out what in this instructional moment works for the instructor, works for me. How much can I push? What are...
Right, and when we're talking about an instructional conversation or a difficult conversation, you want to be able to separate what's an anomaly and what's a behavior.
Yeah.
Right? And when it's an anomaly, it's a one-off. When you see something happening in a pattern, that's when you start to see a behavior or a practice that you might need to have a difficult conversation around, whether it's, you know, I've noticed you're not coming to class, right?
Yes.
Which is like
Yes.
the most basic in
Yes.
teaching, I feel, kind of difficult conversation.
Yeah.
And part of that is the, hey, I see you. I see you not having come to class. I've contacted you when you aren't in class just to say, hey, I hope you're doing okay, et cetera, et cetera. So even that's part of that, like you're building rapport, you're building trust.
Mm-hmm.
You're thinking about, and that's one of the like really basic techniques around building rapport is just like, hey, I saw you weren't in class.
Yeah.
You okay?
Yeah.
We good? You know?
And I would argue, you talked about anomalies, so I do want to talk about that just briefly, and that is, it's really hard to know if anything is an anomaly this early in the semester. Mm-hmm. We haven't had enough to establish a baseline, but I would argue that if you do see anomalies later on, it's not something you necessarily want to ignore, but you do want to approach and say, hey, I noticed today you were having a hard time with. Mm-hmm. And because often these anomalies come because something has happened in their life, and that's the same thing. It's that I see you, mm-hmm. I know something has happened, I'm here to help you, at least instructionally, with things you need, or to send you towards resources if you need other resources, but I can see that something is different, right? And that's an important way to, again, communicate with students. I see you, I care about you, and we're on this journey together.
Right, and we've talked a little bit about, like, lots of these have been like verbal contact with students, but there's other channels that you can do and engage in order to develop that trust and rapport. So one of the things I do every class is exit tickets, and mm-hmm. I have students like rank where they are in terms of certain learning objectives that I have for them. And then there's space where, like, I asked them that, at yesterday's class to tell me how reading changes the brain. Talk about the lobes, what happens in each of the lobes. And then there's always is there anything you want me to know? Is there something that I could do better? And part of like the rapport and trust building is when I get those suggestions, I really entertain them. Like if it's something mm-hmm. that I can do, I do it. So for instance, like all of my readings in my class right now are assignments, because mm-hmm. that came up in more than one exit ticket. At first I was like, ugh, it's so much work. It's so much work. But if my goal is to provide them with access to the materials and that makes it an easier way for them to do it, sure, why not? Mm-hmm. Why am I not doing this? Let's just go. Yeah. And being responsive and showing them that I'm responsive to what their needs are is also building up that trust and support, and that idea that I am demanding as an instructor, mm-hmm. but I'm also supportive as an instructor. I do not set bars that I don't think they can clear. This is not an Olympic.
Yes. And only two of you will make it out.
Right. Like, it's all going to be fine. Like, this is not a zero-sum game.
Yeah, and I think that what you're talking about with collecting data, and I'm working with instructors across the department, especially graduate students who are teaching maybe for the first time, we highly recommend collecting that data, like exit ticket, keep it simple, whether you use technology. I tend to use technology, but sometimes I just want it on a piece of paper. Use something that works for you and that is simple. This needs to not add complication to your life. Mm-hmm. If it's hard for you to read people's handwriting, switch to electronic. That's the easiest way to prevent that from becoming a problem. But then you have to be responsive. That is, if you're going to collect this information and not refer to it or respond to it in any way, they will stop doing it, or they will start seeing it as a burden instead of an opportunity to communicate. Right. So if you want to build trust, you've got to be responsive, even if it is to say, I've heard this was difficult for you. Mm-hmm. I'm not giving up on this. No. But I'm going to go back to it and reinforce it.
It's also a really nice opportunity with the objectives. If they don't understand it, I need help. I can then send them additional resources.
Yes.
And that doesn't necessarily mean I need to reteach it in class, but if I have a video that I've made or there's a website that I know of, I'll send that along and say, hey, I noticed this on your exit ticket. Yeah. I just want to follow up. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can build up that trust and rapport that sets the stage for creating an environment where you can have a difficult conversation without it feeling particularly, right? Our brain is wired to always self-preserve. And so if you're invited into a difficult conversation, that fight or flight mode is activated. And you always want to, as the instructor, you always want to couch it in, I'm doing this because I care about you. This is an act of love. This is an act of me being invested in your development. I don't want you to feel as though this is a gotcha moment. We don't want a gotcha moment.
No, not at all, because that's not productive.
Right. And if you don't have a relationship, it often feels like a gotcha moment. So we've gone over a couple of different kinds of strategies, right? The basic one of like learning names.
Yeah.
Even if you have, like, I have a class of 38 right now, it's a lot of names.
Yes.
I've got a week and a half left to finish learning them all. Whew, it's going to be close.
Yeah.
It's going to be close. Because after 4 weeks, I stop doing name tags and I need to know who they are. And that's kind of my personal challenge, right? And it's also a way I try to model for them, like, look at me, I'm interleaving practice because you all are moving around and you've changed clothes and I'm getting to know all your names and I'm trying not to look at your name tags. But that kind of investment in knowing students' names and not being reliant on name tags. And
although, just to say that around the 38-40 is where the maximum, it's close to the maximum, unless you've got a phenomenal memory, and then all power to you. If you can remember 250 students on site, this is fantastic.
Oh yeah.
At the university, at the high school setting, it might happen. At the university setting, it will not happen. We don't see each other often enough.
Right. And the trick for me is I see them twice a week, right? And I see them for 3 hours each. But also,
I'm just setting expectations.
Right.
Because
if you're in a
have
lecture class.
Yes, that's probably not going to happen.
Lower than 50, you can do it. You might need a couple of weeks. You might need like this week, this semester, because I have so many more, I gave myself 4 weeks. I normally just give myself 3. But it demonstrates to students that I am actively committed to getting to know their names.
Yes.
And that has been so powerful.
It is. It's simple, yet powerful, and there's no way around it.
Right. There's no way around it. So we've talked about exit tickets. We've talked about thinking through and about ensuring that, like, we are responsive to students, all the different ways that we can do that, the ways that we can build up trust. Are there any strategies that we haven't covered yet that you find are particularly helpful?
I use the time, the dead times in class to get to know students. So if you have a class where there's significant amount of group work, spending some time with groups does help you understand who students are. There are always students who come early. That's an opportunity for conversations. I structure some extra time because I have enough. Again, going back to, it depends on really how your class is structured, but I'll let my students off about 15 minutes early once a week. And then I stay with a small group every time. And that's an opportunity to discuss some of the issues. They give me feedback on teaching and some things. So it's another version of the exit ticket, but I get to do it with 3 or 4 and I get to know them a little bit better. And they get to have a conversation with me and not just this anonymous feedback. So that's another way to respond. And I actually use art in my classroom, and that seems to be another way to start conversations and have these creating those moments. And I have 3 times a semester, I actually work with students only in small groups as a way to create rapport. And so I have a multitude of strategies around that, just to make sure that there's an opportunity to connect, create trust, and listen to students. And I think listening is where the next step. So if we are identifying something that is a problem, and the listening is an important first step. So let's talk about what issues do you see coming up that at the higher education level we need to attend to?
So I think one of the issues that comes up a lot is around anxiety and how anxiety begins to manifest, right? And how that creates behaviors, particularly for us training teachers, that are not beneficial to teaching, right?
Yeah.
So we've talked about perfectionism before.
Yeah.
We'll link that episode in a card somewhere. We're trying to get better. So dealing with that perfectionism is tricky, but there's also for us in reading and writing, our students are already skilled readers and writers.
Yeah.
And so they come to class saying, oh, I already know how to do this, so I can teach it. And so there's this disconnect between what they think they can do and what is happening in class.
Yeah.
And oftentimes that there's almost like a defiance to that, like, why are we learning this?
Yes.
Why are you literally, why are you telling me how to explain a word?
Yeah. So there's a challenge with, I think I know this. And that sometimes can turn to an opposite challenge, I would argue, where if you're talking about anxiety, how are we dealing with, I'm never going to get this, which is a problem as well, right? The giving up, that idea of I'm never going to be able to do this arises. We talked about attendance or being late or being on devices instead of being engaged with the lesson. I've had a student who shopped for shoes online for a while before I realized that's what was happening. So there are multiple challenges to seeing what's happening in the classroom. And I think one of the challenges, especially for us, we've taught school, right? We've taught K-12. And in K-12, you take a lot more care with students and you define a lot more things. Eventually, here we deal with quote unquote adults, right? They make decisions and they can decide not to come to class. It has consequences, but they can make some decisions.
Oh yeah, totally.
And we're not saying you can't make decisions. All we're saying is,
there are
unfortunately, the consequences are going to come and mommy's not going to wake you up in the morning to force you to go to school.
Right. Like there's some self-regulation there that needs to be in place, right? And so I think when we're thinking about the behaviors that sometimes require difficult conversations, like attendance is an easy one, right? Like, like that one I can, hey, this is your third absence. You know what the policy is. This is where you're at. Like, according to the policy, at this point in time, you could fail this class.
Yes.
So what is our plan moving forward? How are you going to ensure that you are in class and not just physically, but mentally present?
Yeah.
Right? Like, how is that going to play out? And being sure that there is some kind of like action plan to come out of that conversation that addresses that behavior is really important, because it does impact the learning environment. When you're not here as a student, we miss you.
Yes. And that, I think that's a really important point. And that is, depending on how classes, if it's a lecture, it's much easier. If you miss, it's you. But if it's a more active classroom community, somebody not being there changes the dynamic and changes the learning in ways that we miss you. You missed some materials, but everybody else missed on something as well. Well, to a degree.
And I think we want to, like, if it's a presentation, right? Yeah. If it's a lecture, there's going to be hopefully some kind of interactive bits and bobs there.
Yeah.
Right? Like, lectures get a bad rap.
Yes.
Because oftentimes they get confused with the presentation.
Yeah.
And students think about them as, information that I'm being filled with, versus like a lecture which should bring in your audience, right? And so there is this mismatch between sometimes students thinking they know how learning works
Yeah.
and not knowing how their learning works. And so being clear about one of the most powerful things I've found, and we talked about this in the What Did We Do With Our Summer last year, was being clear and explicit with my students about the kinds of pedagogical choices I'm making and why.
Absolutely. Kind of bringing it to a meta level.
Right. Like
on a regular basis.
One of my students on the way out was like, I've been thinking about you telling us that we have to forget something in order to begin moving something from short-term into long-term memory. And it's totally shifted the way I study.
Yeah.
And I feel more effective.
That's good. Yeah.
And so it's that like, I know what I'm doing.
Yes.
Right? And then that also gives me some meta language for when I have a student not do well in their first exam and we're talking through what's happening there.
Yeah.
We can draw upon that meta language within that dialogue, because you're also going to deal with, disappointment in themselves if something happens, if they don't get a particular assignment grade and they think they should.
So how do you start the conversation? So you have a student, we have a challenge. How do you start the conversation?
So I typically start the conversation by talking about just checking in first off. Hey, how are you? What's going on? How's life? Here's what I've noticed. And I start with behaviors. I've noticed this, I've noticed this, I've noticed this. This is why they could potentially be problematic. What's a possible solution to what's happening here? Talk to me about where that is. So I try to be both very clear and not judgmental.
Yes.
Right?
And the other piece, I think, in that moment of here's what I noticed is it's non-judgmental, but also we talk about the behaviors we see, not the assumptions we make. Because we can make a lot of assumptions and we have an emotional response when somebody gets out and leaves class early, right? And at the moment we're in the middle of teaching and they just disappear, and sometimes you don't know what to do with this, and sometimes you're like, I'm not going to disrupt everybody's focus and progress because somebody's making a move, but I do need to check in later. There's an emotional response and there's an assumption about what has happened, what does that say. A lot of people are really care about respect and consideration for everybody else, and so you can come into that conversation with some emotion, and you need to check that. And for me, it's talk about the behavior, and then I kind of flip that. I talk about the behavior. This is what I've been noticing. I do ask how they are, but this is what I'm noticing. Tell me a little bit about it. So I ask them to first talk about the behavior and just listen, and then come in with okay, these are the reasons it might be a problem. Let's talk about it. I had to have a lot of these conversations right after the pandemic when we were back in person, but some students were choosing to come in digitally, and inadvertently I created a situation that I needed to rectify. This was on me. I was honest with them about that. I made that possible. You took advantage of that. Not took advantage, but you took that opportunity and you thought this was a good choice. Here's why I think it's really not working for you or for me. Conversation. So that's the addition for me.
And I find the important thing there is to be excruciatingly honest and not sugarcoat things.
Yes.
To save someone's feelings.
Yes.
Right? So like we want to check our feelings, but we also want to be sure that we're being as honest as we possibly can in terms of when we're seeing those behaviors, what impacts those could have on those behaviors, connecting why those behaviors are impacting their current education at the moment, which is, we have the added bonus of like, look, we're doing things so that you can support students later.
Yes.
And I try to always be very clear about everything in my syllabus, everything that we talk about serves a particular function. You're missing out if you're missing class, you're skipping out on these functions. If you come to this knowledge base thinking you know it all, but you can't tell me why you clap at a syllable, that tells me that you can't explain that to a child.
Yeah. And so we have the hard conversation, and you talked about one of the outcomes has to be a very concrete plan. Here's what we're going to do, 1, 2, 3. I like backing it up with an email after that says, we had a conversation. Either I ask the student to do it, what is your understanding? What are we going to do? Send it to me. Or depending on the situation, I say, I'm going to summarize this and I'm sending it to you because now we've got, quote unquote, a paper trail that says, this is what we agreed on, and I'm sending it so the other person can respond and say, yes, this is what we agreed on, or no, this is not what we agreed on. I thought we were having a different conversation. This is an opportunity. But that's another layer of clarity and protection for you as an instructor, especially if you're a graduate student or a young assistant professor and you have a student that is pushing back or potentially even gaslighting. Once in a while, we have those as well.
We love the gaslighting.
Yes.
Love it.
So have
Makes us feel all
documentation.
lightheaded. Yes.
Have documentation. This is what we talked about when we met. This was the decision. This is how we're going to resolve this. And then, what do we need to do?
Follow up.
Follow up.
And before we talk about follow-up,
Yes.
I do think it's important to remind ourselves to this is not a reprimand, right? This is not, as we talked about earlier, a gotcha moment. Like, we are not naughty. This is an instructional moment.
Yes.
It is a potential moment to help that student elevate their current practices or replace ineffective practices with more effective practices. And it's a partnership, really, with that student and making that clear that I am investing in you.
Yes.
This is an act of love.
And sometimes, and you talked a little bit about this, sometimes it's through that conversation, they realize, you help them see what is it in their studying practices, learning practices, the way they manage their life, what is it that is derailing them? And maybe they need to reconsider whether it's bad study habits, maybe it's taking on way too much and not being able to sort to what is the most important thing for my goals right now. I'm in school. Yes, I have all these social obligations and work and all of these things. If it's too much, what am I giving up?
What can you cut back on? There are 24 hours in a day, right?
Because if not, your default is you're cutting on your university, which is probably in the long term, if you want, in our case, if you want to be a teacher, that's not working for you. But if you want to become a lawyer and you need good grades, that's not going to work for you either. A whole host of things, and just helping them think through the problem is really the moment. Because we can always, as instructors, we can always, the ultimate reprimand is, we can give an F, right? We are justified in doing that and not actually support students. What we're saying is the hard conversation is actually a support for students.
But and I think there's other, I think the grades conversations, the attendance conversations are really easy. But when we're, I also want to think about the increasing diversity within our classroom spaces.
Absolutely.
And so you could have students in your classroom space who are neurodivergent, and that requires a different kind of skill set where you're really thinking through, what's the behavior that I'm seeing right now? What's the process by which I can help you replace that behavior that's not productive for you, that's not, so if a student is constantly interrupting class, for instance, and for us, it might not just be class, it might be practicum, it might be things that are happening in their classroom, and it's happened more than once and more than twice, which is kind of my what's in my brain in terms of frequency. I will then figure out what's an alternative strategy. Like, what can I ask them to do when they want to interrupt class that they can start implementing themselves, and that strategy eventually becomes a skill, and how to communicate that. Because oftentimes, again, that like excruciatingly honest and direct conversation, like sometimes bashes up against this Midwest nice.
Yes, very
thing.
much so.
And one of the tricks, potentially, if you're working with students who are neurodivergent, is they're not going to get the nuance in Midwest nice. And so you have to be clear, you have to be direct, and you have to have a plan.
Yes.
That you can clearly explain.
Yes.
And I think the thing that you're hinting toward is it's important to follow through.
Yes, absolutely.
And recognize
for both sides.
For all of it, to recognize when students are following up on the strategies or the plans that we've co-constructed with them to think stuff through. It's really important, right? It's a little behaviorist, a little Pavlovian maybe, but like there's something about, hey, I see what you're doing. You're doing a great job. I appreciate you.
I don't know if it's Pavlovian, but what we are working when, especially in higher education, when you teach, one of the things that is always in the back of my mind is these students have had many years in education, many, many years where they've developed habits and they are deeply ingrained. And they've coped obviously in one way or another, or they wouldn't have gotten to this point, and this is fantastic, but they may need to reshape the way they are learning, because what might have been effective before is not effective anymore, for a variety of reasons, and the expectations are different. So helping them think through that problem and that feedback, both from us, but also from them, if they need to report in and say, here's what I've done so far, this is the progress I've made, and all of that, helps support them in changing something that may be fairly deeply ingrained. Or when we're talking about neurodivergent students, we're talking about things that they can't help from a physical perspective. They can just find strategies around that.
Right.
And so that requires a lot of effort. There's effort in there. The easiest thing is to slide into existing patterns. The hardest thing is to create new patterns. So we have to find ways to support, to help define those patterns, and to help students find how they can cope, and then give them feedback, but also have them report back to us.
Right, because I think the important part with any kind of difficult conversation, if there's not a pathway forward and there's not an accountability to that pathway forward, that's when it becomes simply a reprimand.
Yes.
That's when it's a gotcha moment. That's when it's a bad guy bad. And you just move on with your life. But that doesn't do anything to... I remember Elizabeth Heilman, who was one of my professors at Michigan State when I was in undergrad, would always say in her class, my teaching objective is to have you leave my class a better person than you were when you came at the start. And that's essentially like what we're doing in these conversations. Like, how are we elevating that student work? And that follow-up, that show of investment, the extension of that initial investment is important. And I also don't want to freak viewers out around like, oh my gosh, there's all these difficult conversations. No. Like
there aren't that many.
It's a handful, right?
Yes.
I do find that like pattern-wise, if you do that work of establishing rapport, trust, structure, a lot of stuff just lines up.
Yes.
But sometimes some things don't line up, and that's when you have to have these kind of difficult conversations.
Yeah.
So I don't want to...
Yeah, it's not that you have five of them a week during the semester. You have one or two a semester in most cases.
Right. Maybe, and they tend to happen, mid-semester.
Yes.
As students kind of relax into the semester, like stuff starts to slip or stuff starts to happen. The newness of the semester wears off.
Mm-hmm. And then there's some feedback on behavior, and things get a little more complicated.
Dicey.
Yeah.
a good
But
tendency.
also we start seeing the patterns because the pattern may have been there at the beginning, but it's not a pattern in the first 2 weeks of the semester.
You sometimes
So,
don't have data around a pattern until right around now. You're 3 weeks in, right? For me, tomorrow will be the 6th time I've seen my students.
yeah, that starts establishing.
I'm noticing some patterns, and one of the things that is helpful to me is I have a contact form that I fill out after every class where I kind of lay out, oh, I noticed this about this student, this about this student, this about this student. And that does a couple of things. That helps me think through which students I'm not connecting with, which students I'm not building rapport with, which students I'm not creating a sense of belonging potentially for. And then it also provides me an audit trail when I go back and I'm looking at behaviors. If there are difficult conversations that I think I need to have, it provides me with data to move into that conversation.
And I want to say 2 more things that I think are connected. One is part of that prep ground in creating a community is establishing policies, but also establishing the connections between students. Students often resist, for example, working with, they form groups and then they kind of get stuck in those groups. And I think it is very good practice to avoid that. And you have to do that fairly early. If you let them form these groups and stay in them for the first half of the semester, they will not go there the second half of the semester. So it's got to be very explicit. You've got to talk, and we talk a lot about why do we do this in helping them understand what happens. The second thing that I constantly think about as I think about especially being a young assistant professor or a graduate student teaching, is go and talk to a faculty mentor about these conversations, play them out, design what questions you're gonna ask. Don't just go into that conversation without preparation. Prepare. Have some, if you have a hard time, I have a hard time sometimes doing that. After 20-something years, it gets easier. But I would write down the questions I want to ask. What are the points? I would write down the things I observed. I'm not reading from paper, but I have an anchor where if I get lost or if the student is asking a question, I have something to go back to and say, here's what I saw and here are the questions that I have. So I'm not in the discussion and in a conversation suddenly losing it. And again, ask for advice. Don't go in without having a practice conversation of one kind or another.
One last build on.
Yeah.
A list like that, when you're having these difficult conversations, that intense focus on addressing the behavior, then is not the time to bring in something else.
Yeah. Focus on the one thing you want to address. Yes.
What is the primary function of that conversation? What is the action plan moving forward? How do they understand the action plan? How do you understand the action plan? That's what you need from that conversation. Don't conflate it with other gibberish.
And don't let students do that because students might also try to go around the problem by saying, here's something I didn't understand in class. And this is that's fine. We can do that another time.
That's fine.
We're focusing on this.
Not the place for this conversation, right? Again, that excruciating honesty.
Yes.
is really important. But yeah, I mean, you're going to have, if you were in the field of education, if you're in the field of ensuring that, or trying to ensure that people grow and develop in productive ways, difficult conversations are a part of this.
Yes.
And by being, somewhat thoughtful in the ways that we're approaching it, it can make them a little less, hopefully, difficult.
Yes.
Right, to prepare for. So, conversations, maybe that's what we want to go for. Conversations.
Yes.
But I mean, they're still going to be tough.
Yes.
But by really thinking through how you're establishing that classroom space, by really setting up a solid context and environment, and I feel like you are really good at that,
That's right.
And succeed. Excruciatingly honest guy. Just say thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
By making sure that you're setting up, having channels for building trust, whether they're digital, conversational, practice-based, and then focusing in on those behaviors and being clear about what they are and helping that student with a plan moving forward and then following up. I think that will be, I think that's a handy kind of heuristic for if you're a first-time instructor thinking, oh, I have to have a conversation with the student about this. What do I do? How do I do it?
Yes.
Anything else you would add?
Not taking care of the tough conversation is going to create a contagion. So it will spread and other students either will adapt those behaviors or will be bothered by those behaviors to the point that they stop paying attention or they get less out of the class.
Right.
So that's not taking care of these behaviors is probably a bad option.
Yes.
That is the one thing I did want to say, because there's an instinct to try to avoid taking care of those hard conversations because it feels confrontational. Again, what we're saying is it's not confrontational. We're here to help you. But it does carry with it some challenges.
It does carry with it some challenge. And I think for instructors, perhaps some stress around that.
Yes.
But remember that if these behaviors are getting in the way in students learning, it doesn't matter how well you know your content, you're not teaching them. And that's your job.
Yeah.
So you have to do this as part of your job.
And I've never had a tough conversation I regretted. I regretted not having a tough conversation, but the other way has never happened.
I don't think so. Also, when you have a tough conversation, block about a half hour afterwards to just decompress.
With or without somebody else that you can talk to.
Just have that time to decompress.
Yeah.
But tough conversations, they're going to happen. You will be able to get through them. It's part of our dedication to elevating students. So I think that's all we have.
That's all we have for this time.
Feels like a lot. It feels heavy.
It was a little heavy. So next time, maybe not so heavy.
A little lighter.
Yeah.
A little lighter.
All right.
We'll see you in the next one.